Take a look at our shaders here in Lightwave. We have quite a number of shaders available to us, and it's this variety of selection that makes them so incredibly useful when we come to construct our surfaces. A shader is a simple model, basically a math model, which calculates the interaction between light rays, surfaces, and of course the position of the viewer or camera. As such, most shaders are basically angular functions, looking at angles of surfaces and light rays. The Lambert shader, for instance, its basic model is the setup that we see in the spot dot tutorial on my YouTube. Very simple to get along with and wrap your head round how the shader itself is made, but that's fair enough, it's been around a while. It was the height of computer graphics back in the 1770s, or thereabouts. What we have with our different shaders are the different classes: diffuse, reflection, specular, and so on. Basically, different shaders to deal with different surface parameters. Those that deal with diffuse reflection, those that deal with specular reflection, which is of course a faked highlight, and those of course that deal with real reflections and refractions. We'll start out here on the diffuse and take a quick peek first of all at the old Lambert shader. Shaders are of course usually plugged into the appropriate shader input. We see that there's basically not much difference other than a slight change in colour. If I equalise the colour between this and the regular panel, there we go, we can see that there's no shift at all. Reason why Lambert shader is the default Lightwave shader that's always been there. If you were working outside of Nodal, then this is the diffuse shader that was being used. And it is pretty good for a lot of general surfaces, though more especially smoother ones. If we take a look at Oren-Naya and Minaya, I think that's right, doubtless people in the Netherlands are telling me no. Both of these shaders are more suited to slightly roughened surfaces. We'll take Minaya first, and we don't get a huge change, but we just need to tweak a few parameters. Mainly, the darkening here. Let's set it at 20%, and you see what we get is a bright rim around the edge here, which of course is the direction that the light there is coming from. What Minaya will do is tend to reflect a greater proportion of the light that hits its surface back toward the direction it came from, rather at some other angle that bounces off to reach a viewer. One thing you may spot if you look at the little preview sphere is that it's got that lovely little bright rim highlight that's quite synonymous with certain planetary imagery. No surprise, seeing as this illumination function is derived from the study of space bodies, but it does make it an excellent shader to use for asteroids or non-atmospheric planets and the like. The B version uses a similar function, but with a more graduated drop-off, and also more of a darkening base towards the viewer's angle, even when the viewer is looking from the light angle. Otherwise, the B version is just a slightly different attenuated version. Minaya, other than just being good for space rock, is actually also good for an awful lot of cloth surfaces as well. Many cloth surfaces have additional brightness around the edges and tend to darken from direct view. Again, a good place for Minaya B. Other fabrics are still rough, but a bit softer in their treatment of light. They're a good candidate for Oren-Naya shading, as are other soft rough materials like clay or similar. Again here, similar to darkening, we have a roughness setting, which rather than bringing up the shadowing, as you can see, tends to take down the highlight more. The Oren-Naya roughness model tends to scatter the light more rather than reflect it back on itself, which Minaya does. Handy little shader. The occlusion shaders are for shading ambient occlusion. Pretty straightforward. We don't see a huge amount of it here on our vase object, but we can see some if we look underneath at where the base part is there. And then the original occlusion, which has a scalar output rather than a shader. What this says about this occlusion node, and actually also goes for occlusion 2, is that it's not uncommon to use them elsewhere in a network, maybe for multiplying a colour map, to just set occlusion into the colour map before it actually gets shaded, or similar. What you'll find is more or less the same sort of controls, whether it's infinite occlusion or ranged. Ranged is usually easier to control, and in the case of occlusion 2 here, we can change the amount of sharpness essentially that the occlusive shadow has. Also note occlusion 2 has an interpolated mode. Nice and quick and good for stills, not so hot for animation. And you can also have coloured occlusion. Here I've just selected the existing backdrop, which is a DP sun sky. But you can use that, for instance, for creating ambient colour passes of your scene or objects as well, which is why occlusion 2 has a full colour diffuse shader output. Translucency and theta are both translucency shaders. As such, they're kind of shaders in reverse. Notice how all of these shader previews have the light on one side, but these guys have it on the other. These essentially produce back shading. Let's take a look at translucency. As we can see, it kind of looks a bit weird and a bit wrong, and has this awful black seeming artifact on it. Well, the seeming black artifact is actually self-shadowing. If we turn that off for this object, then that goes away, and that helps us better see what translucency is doing here. You notice that when I'm looking into the light through the object, it's nice and bright, but if I look at it from the lit side, it's completely black. See, the translucency shaders, both of these guys, are the same in that fashion, that they take in the backlighting of translucent objects. Most commonly though, such objects you do want to have a front side, so it's not uncommon at all to blend these with a regular shader. Easiest way is just to grab a mixer here, you can plug one to background, one to foreground, colour to the shading input, leave the blending on normal and set the opacity at, well, whatever mix I like, 50, 60, 30, what have you. Of course, both materials here having their diffuse or amount at 100% and being blended by 50 means that this combination shader is still energy conserving. Had I of course used blending mode additive, then the surface would be returning twice as much light as it was receiving. So normal and a percentage to blend them is generally the best way. And now we can see that as I roll round I get my front side as well as translucent shading on my object here, based very much on my own angle of view. One last little thing I wish to point out before I just move on to the other shaders is the fact that a great many shaders, not just diffuse but other ones as well, have a function input. What this means is we can take function nodes, gamma, sine, bias are usually pretty common ones for this, and we can plug them in to attenuate the shading function. You remember that I said that most shaders are just using angles between light and surface and viewer. Shading is there of course drawn as a gradient across the curvature of surface, across the angle of surface, and so by plugging in a function node we can essentially remap the curve that defines how light behaves as it creeps along a surface. And this basically means that we can start to extend the standard shaders and get even greater ranges of looks out of them, which gives us the ability to simulate a far wider variety of materials. Since one of the things that has an awful lot to do with giving a material its aesthetic character is the way that light creeps across its surface and the sharpness of its shadow terminator. Being able to play with that and within existing shader models is a particularly powerful feature available to surface artists. So on to others, and we have of course our reflection shaders here. Good old standard reflections, which when you plug it in doesn't seem to do anything. You still need to give a reflection amount, which obviously you can drive nodally, or of course you can still be entering it here on the surface panel. We would often in either case find a way to use a Fresnel gradient and so on, but for this example here I'm just going to have it plain. Right, and we can see what we've got. It's just a reflections shader, that's all, nothing more, and works like the tab here for spherical maps and whatnot. You can add a colour tint to reflections, which can be good for some surfaces, and you also have reflection blurring built in, which of course gives you nice soft blurry reflections. Do note, this does not need to be a big value. Look at, just 5% has really softened out that reflection there. It's hard to see, I know, on this object perhaps, because there's not a lot of complexity in the scene to be reflected. But if we look at where it is reflecting itself, and indeed the detail of the horizon, we can see that even low values produce quite a clear blur and softening. People often try and turn this up very high when they want really soft reflective surfaces. That can increase render time a lot. Do take care. This can often be lower than you might think you would need. Dispersion is for a diffraction effect, which doesn't show up too well in this particular scene, but basically starts to chromatically shift the reflections out into their red, green and blue components, slightly separated from one another, like you would get in an oil slick or similar. Very expensive render-wise dispersion can be, especially high values. Let's not forget anisotropic reflections, which are basically exactly the same, except they are anisotropic, which means we get these streaky reflections of things, as we're starting to see here on the neck of our vase. in all honesty, need a bit of a more complex environment to show that. But the anisotropic specular node will show it off well enough. And there we see this single line highlight, this anisotropic streak light highlight, and so good for simulating brushed metal surfaces and so on. Effectively, the axis that you put in defines the angle of brushing. Here, cylindrical on the Y is as if there are little grooves running around it on its Y-axis here, and that causes the highlight to streak downwards across them. So that's how you use the mapping. We do have other specular nodes though, Blinn, Cook-Torrance and Phong here. Blinn again is the standard model that we've been used to in Lightwave, good for a wide range of materials. It tends to produce this semi-sharp highlight, so it tends to go well on glossier materials, plastics and lacquered surfaces and so on. Phong is a very similar model, but with slightly bigger and broader highlights, often good for high gloss, polished things, tin cans, hard plastics, smooth hard plastics and the like. Cook-Torrance is a roughened specular model. The roughness, of course, is on the glossiness setting, but we can see a much softer highlight here with the Cook-Torrance. Even if I turn the specular way up, it's a very soft highlight indeed. Again, this can be very useful for many things that don't produce sharp highlights. Cloths, carpet, wallpaper, skin, and so on. It actually goes very well paired with the Oren-Naya diffuse shader. Allows you to get very nice soft matte surfaces quite easily by combining the two. Subsurface scattering I won't talk about too much. Legacy nodes are pretty much as well left alone on more recent versions of Lightwave. They can be render intensive, and under certain conditions each has its own artifacts. SSS and SSS2, neither of which will work with VPR sadly, are very simple little subsurface shader nodes, which of course plug into diffuse shading, and of course are best seen from where we can have some light penetration there. Basically here, and we'll go look at SSS first, the diffuse amount is taken from the regular diffuse input. All you really change is the colour of the subsurface shading. So just to show it off a little bit, I'm going to put some green there. A refraction index and a distance. This is quite a thick object, so let's make it about a half meter. Push F9 and see what we get. So there we go. We can see our light coming through here in what is of course the shadow side of the object there. If we take a look at its front and render again, then we see that we get a reasonably average sort of surface. Again, we can see a bit of the light coming through the side there. What we'll also notice about this node is that it's a pre-process node. The same is true for both SSS and SSS2, which means again they're good for stills but not so much for animation. SSS2 here, basically the same kind of control, except you effectively have two diffuse values. One diffuse, which is the side of the surface we're seeing here, the lit side or the forward, and another diffuse for the back side, which is of course how much illumination comes through. In this case I've set the backward colour to be green. You'll notice I have a separate forward colour, so you can have a different colour shine through than the surface colour. There we go. You can see quite nice, pleasing effect from SSS2. It does give very pretty shading. If we swing round, see the lighted side, or a bit of half and half maybe there. Then we can see how the different colours interblend with one another as we've rotated around our object here. So they can come in to be pretty handy nodes. Many subsurface-like materials, wax and whatnot. But of course not being so good for animation means you use them less on characters and similar. And also you may find that some of the material nodes that feature SSS are preferable to using the direct shaders anyway. Lastly then we have the refraction shaders, which are for transparent refractions. Again, I've given some transparency here rather than into the node. If we take a look at regular refractions there, just plug them in. Notice they don't look too hot straight off the bat because we need refraction index greater than 1. I'm just going to go with 1.4 here, which is fairly bendy. And we can see that we get a lovely glass-like effect there. We do here have, of course, tinting and blurring, just like reflections. Bit of a tint, let's say a pale blue, can give you lovely coloured glass, and with some blurring, and you don't need much, you can get really nice smoky glass effects very easily. Anisotropic refractions, more or less the same thing as we saw with specular and reflection. The difference being that these guys are not so easy to see the streaked behaviour of, and again, just by default, gives a lovely smoked glass effect. Again, a small spot of tinting does wonders. And there we can see the banding in this refraction, which is of course the anisotropy of it in action. So I hope this guide to the shaders has been informative for you and has given you some nice ideas for how you might want to build your surfaces from their very shader base in future.